Hello, and welcome to this presentation by the Refugee Nurses of Australia about our standards of practice. My name is Sandy Eager, and I'm the current chairperson of the Refugee Nurses of Australia. Refugee Nurses of Australia, or RNA, was launched in October 2016. Following a year of meetings and discussions by senior refugee health nurses across Australia. The aim of the RNA is to provide a professional platform for nurses working in refugee health. Specifically, the aims of the RNA is to provide a forum for the exchange of information and resources between refugee health nurses and other relevant stakeholders across Australia, promote best practice in refugee health nursing through quality improvements, professional practice and evidence-based research, provide leadership in the development of a national refugee health nurse clinical practice framework, including the scope of practice, credentialing and models of care. And finally, we will advocate for refugee and asylum seeker issues. RNA has a steering committee with representation from all the states and territories across Australia. And I would like to sincerely thank those members of the steering committee who contributed hours to the standards of practice. There were many debates, there were discussions, periods of self-reflection amongst the group, and I would personally particularly like to thank Bronwyn Blake, Leanne Schmidt, Meryl Jones, Marilyn Spratling and Jan Williams for their considered contribution and superb editing work. In 2017, in October, RNA held its first national forum at Liverpool, New South Wales, and 60 refugee health nurses joined us on the day, a day of networking, a day of education, a day of discussion, and most importantly, our afternoon session was the competency framework session brainstorm. We asked two relatively simple questions. What do you do as a refugee health nurse, and what skills do you need to work effectively with refugees? We were joined in the afternoon session by Professor Liz Howcombe from the University of Wollongong to help us guide us through the standards of practice. Liz has extensive knowledge and experience in devising competency frameworks, and most recently has assisted the Australian Practice Nurses of Australia to devise and to publish their standards of practice. As registered nurses, we adhere to the standards of practice as published by the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia. These 7 standards that you can see here on your screen underpin and guide the practice of all registered nurses across Australia. The RNA did not intend to replace these standards. What we did was use these standards and build on these standards to devise our practice standards for refugee health nursing. A refugee health nurse is a registered nurse who practices within a variety of clinical environments that use a primary health model of care underpinned by the philosophy of trauma-informed care. We acknowledge the dynamic contemporary political environment and thus advocate and defend the rights of the individual, family and community. Refugee health nurses deliver care that is culturally informed, inclusive, sensitive and safe. Each of the following standards have accompanying criteria which show how to demonstrate that standard in practice. The standards include professional knowledge and skills and capture the myriad of personal characteristics and attributes that underlie the scope of practice in this area of nursing. Standard 1. A refugee health nurse practices in a manner consistent with professional and health systems values. We recognise the value of continuing education and professional reflection. We comply with policies and guidelines that have implications for practice. We contribute to local, state and national guidelines, membership of working parties and professional associations. And we acknowledge the risk of vicarious trauma and actively engage with relevant support systems, including peer, clinical supervision and debriefing. Standard 2. Communicates effectively. The refugee health nurse understands the legal and ethical frameworks of using interpreters as fundamental to quality practice. Advocate for the use of qualified interpreters as a right for effective communication. We demonstrate expertise in working with interpreters, and we're able to assess and communicate effectively with clients with varying levels of health literacy. We create a safe environment that facilitates that effective communication inclusive of the interpreter, and apply understanding of dialect, age and gender as integral aspects of professional communication in the request for a specific interpreter. We also assess the risk of vicarious trauma to our interpreters and facilitate and advocate for professional support service for them as necessary. Standard 3. We provide culturally safe and contextually informed care. We acknowledge the potential impact of unconscious bias on our own practice and the delivery of equitable care. We recognise, understand and respond to the dynamic political environment in which refugee health is embedded, understanding the past political contexts and current global events which force individuals to seek safety outside their country of origin. We acknowledge and understand the impact of pre- and post-forced migration trauma, which may include torture and gender-based violence. We're aware of the challenges of adjustment to life in Australia and the impact of resettlement on health and well-being. We build trusting relationships and actively foster a safe and therapeutic clinical environment within the framework of trauma-informed care and practice. We practice predominantly within a primary health care model which acknowledges the social determinants of health, and we educate and orientate clients to the Australian health system and promote understanding of rights and responsibilities. Standard 4. Conducting a comprehensive nursing assessment. And a note on this standard: this was the one standard that provoked the most debate and comment amongst the steering committee. This indeed reflects the different models of care that are in practice by refugee health nurses across Australia. These are aspirational models of care for some nurses, and we would hope that you could use the standards of practice to reflect upon and develop your own model of care going forward. We do a holistic assessments utilising culturally appropriate and evidence-based tools and recommendations. We assist other health professionals in the provision of catch-up immunisation. We utilise culturally appropriate resources related to clinical assessment and assist people and educate people about their health-seeking behaviours. Standard 5, effectively plan care that meets individual needs. Refugee health nurses are knowledgeable of both specialised refugee services and mainstream health services, their access criteria and referral pathways. We develop a coherent plan of care in collaboration with the client, their family and other health professionals, and provide follow-up and ongoing support and engagement with individuals and families. And again, we utilise appropriate tools and translated information for the planning of that care. Standard 6, actively engage in health education and promotion. Refugee health nurses understand the impact of a person's health beliefs, biases and behaviours on health education and health promotion activities, and therefore advocate for the development and translation of required resources and tools. We introduce the concept and provide ongoing education regarding preventative health and screening across the lifespan. We partner with key community and bilingual educators to facilitate community engagement and health promotion, and assess and monitor individual, family and community learning through culturally appropriate tools. Standard 7, advocate for the equitable health access and self-determination. And I draw your attention to the photo used on this slide. These are health professionals and other community activists in Queensland, Australia, whereupon baby Asha had been recently transferred from Australia's offshore processing camp in Nauru. Upon time to discharge, the doctors and other health staff made a decision that transferring and discharging Asha back to the island of Nauru actually put that child as a child at risk. Despite intense pressure from the Australian government at the time, the health professionals stood their ground. Baby Asha was discharged with her mother into the care of the Australian community. Again, the refugee health nurse utilises the social determinants of health as the basis for advocacy. We understand the Australian healthcare system, including clients' rights and their responsibility, recognise access issues, and actively work to empower and overcome access barriers, educate and build capacity in the wider workforce, which interconnects with refugee communities and refugee-specific services. And finally, we provide opportunities to the undergraduate and postgraduate health workforce for clinical placement. On a final note, the steering committee chose carefully in the terminology that we have used. We have embraced the definition of cultural safety as it's based on a partnership relationship where the vulnerable other is at liberty to negotiate their care, even if that means nurses changing how things are practiced generally. Cultural safety requires a level of cognitive, attitudinal and personal skills that enhance communication and interaction with others. Cultural safety does require personal reflective practice, however, so that nurses can recognise values, culturally including their own, and who this may conflict with others. Finally, trauma-informed care is a strengths-based framework grounded in an understanding and responsiveness to the impact of trauma that emphasises physical, psychological and emotional safety for both survivors and providers, and that creates opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. If you would like to add your comments to our standards of practice, we consider this to be a living document. The standards will remain on our website at Refugee Nurses Australia, and from time to time will be revisited. We will again formally look at the standards in about 18 months to see what, if anything, needs changing. So what's next for the Refugee Nurses of Australia? Following this major piece of work, and again I thank the steering committee for their hard work, their editing, their choice of language and the reflection that they were able to do. We will now go forward to develop a professional development framework, including quantifying what is that knowledge base for practice as a refugee health nurse, review the qualitative and quantitative research that is already published, and look at opportunities for research by refugee nurses. We'll also be considering what are the competencies for the novice refugee health nurse and what does advanced practice look like for the refugee health nurse. Please continue to contribute to the development of the Refugee Nurses of Australia. Thank you very much. This has been Sandy Eager.